hindsight. The big success was his Theorie der wirtschaftlichen Entwicklung in 1912, and the English edition came out in 1934, and the Japanese edition, about which I will talk in a moment, in 1937. And then Business Cycles was a very successful book, written at Harvard, 1939. Then probably his biggest hit was Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Certainly he called it a potboiler, a popular book, 1942, and then some other things. The last one, for example, I used to study for my preliminary examinations in economics. Here, however, is the work that put him on the world map. Here he made a lot of points, but the three most important points are these: that the economic growth that we saw in earlier charts was attributable primarily to what he called new combinations, what he also called innovations, technological and other innovations that advanced productivity and raised standards of living. That was his main point. That was responsible more than anything else for the growth of economic prosperity. Second point was that these innovations were accomplished through acts, often heroic acts, of entrepreneurship, breaking out of conventional modes of thinking and bringing forward new technologies, new products, new sources of supply, new methods of business organization. And then finally, he showed in this book how the economic process itself generated the incentives for output increasing innovation. That is to say, this was 1912. What we now say that innovation is endogenous. It's an essential part of and motivated by the economic system. Now, in some sense, this was not new. Adam Smith had a couple of pages. They were very, very perceptive pages about the role of inventions and scientific discoveries. David Ricardo had a whole chapter in the second edition of his Principles on the role of machinery, which he argued gave Britain comparative advantage in international trade. He didn't really go much into how the innovations got there and why Britain, of all nations, should have that comparative advantage. But he did have a chapter on it. And then, however, it was Karl Marx who really made innovation the centerpiece of the functioning of the economy. Here's a little quotation from Marx and Engels in the Communist Manufacture and the Communist Manifesto. And let me just read a part of it. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, the bourgeoisie were the capitalists, so to speak, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, etc., etc. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? That was center to Marxist theory. Now, one reads in the the theory of economic development, Theorie der wirtschaftlichen Entwicklung, I once went through the original German edition and found 3 very, very minor footnotes to Marx. Schumpeter had studied Marx at Vienna, but he didn't pay any attention at all to Marx in his great opus. Why? Well, he finally admitted that he had done something wrong in the preface to the Japanese translation of Theory of Economic Development, 1937 again. It was not clear to me at the outset what to the reader will be obvious, namely that my ideas and my aim are exactly the same, exactly the idea and aim which underlie the economic teaching of Karl Marx. In fact, what distinguishes him from the economists of his own time and those who preceded him was precisely a vision of economic evolution as a distinct process generated by the economic system itself. In other words, innovation was endogenous to the economic system. Now, why did he not admit this right up front in Theory of Economic Development? Now, I think the answer is pretty simple. That he wrote TED, actually he wrote it at Scherer, but he wrote it in the Austrian Empire, which was very, very politically conservative at the time. And he I think, believed that if he mentioned Marx as a prototype, people simply wouldn't take him seriously. And he wanted to be taken seriously, so he just omitted mention of his Marxian origins in Theory of Economic Development. Then he came back in the Japanese edition and had this preface admitting that his roots were in Marx. And then in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, 1942, he has 4 full chapters. The first 4 chapters are devoted to Marx. Now, why the change? The change, I think, is attributable to the fact that by this time the Soviet Union had a communist system, a Marxist system, and was beginning to show that it was capable of very substantial economic growth. People really took communism seriously in those days. When I was an undergraduate, we studied Marx. I took a whole course on Marxian economics, and we did this in all seriousness in the early 1950s. But when Theory of Economic Development first came out, it was simply too radical to admit that it was his ideas were rooted most solidly in Marxist ideas. Now, the Theory of Economic Development had another emphasis. His idea was that the economic system went on and on. The so-called circular flow went on and did things in a routine way. But then innovations broke the equilibrium. And those innovations, he thought, mainly came from entrepreneurs who were outside the main flow of economic activity. Heroic little men was his notion of entrepreneurs. But then he changed his position very sharply by the time that he wrote published in 1942, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. I saw one of the papers this afternoon referred to work by David Maury. One of Maury's seminal publications showed that in 1921, only 35% of in other words 70, of the 200 largest U.S. Manufacturers reported that they had formal research and development programs. 35%. By 1946, it was 84%. So there was a tremendous growth of research, development, and innovation in American industry between the time of theory of economic development and the time of capitalism, socialism, and democracy. And Schumpeter took account of it, saying, in effect, that monopolies had the ability to amass the capital and take the risks that were involved in modern innovation, and second, that they had incentives to undertake these risks and these investments and allocate this talent, because if they didn't do so, they were going to be overrun by other innovators, by other actors in the process. And here he coined a phrase that has become very popular in the last half dozen years, but only recently, that if they didn't innovate, they would be overwhelmed by somebody else in the process of creative destruction. Now here, unfortunately, Schumpeter got it wrong. I mean, he got it right for his time, but the times changed. He published in 1942, over here on the north side of Harvard Yard. On the south side of Harvard Yard, beginning in 1946, a Harvard Business School professor, Georges Doriot, had become president of the first American high technology venture investment firm, American Research and Development Corporation. And I remember I was Doriot's student. Doriot argued day after day after day that innovation was central to American prosperity, and that his firm would find these little guys who had great innovative ideas and finance them so that their ideas became reality. Now that spread to Silicon Valley, and then it spread throughout the United States. And I think it's very clear that it is the central provider of technological progress in the United States, founding little new firms that are small firms and competing against the established giants. There are, to be sure, some exceptions, but by and large, that is where the action is in the United States. And that was very clear by the 1960s when I became an economist. And I remember going over to Fontainebleau in 1965 to a conference about why Europe lagged the United States technologically. The OECD had written publications about the so-called technology gap. And what should Europe do to remedy this technology gap? The keynote speaker at the conference was Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, at that time finance minister of France, later president. And he said the problem with France, and Europe more generally, the problem with France and Europe is that we do not have giant national champion enterprises of the sort that Schumpeter worshipped in capitalism, socialism, and democracy. We need to implement policies to build these national giants. There were quite a few economists from the United States at the conference, and a few from Sussex in Britain, among others. And we all said almost in one voice, "You're crazy. You're wrong. You don't understand the real dynamism of the American economy." But France did go its way, a way advocated by Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber a year later in his book Les Défis Américains. They tried to build national champion enterprises, And they really succeeded in a couple of respects. They succeeded in nuclear energy. France probably has the best nuclear energy industry in the world. They succeeded in aerospace, building the Airbus consortium, but in most other areas they failed. The same philosophy was absorbed in Germany, and I remember in 1974 there was a conference in the then capital of Germany, Bonn, which was very, very 1942 Schumpeterian. The Science and Technology Minister, Volker Hauff, convened a conference of economists from all over the world, and he gave an opening speech in which he said, we're going to begin a program of subsidizing the research and development of national champions. I'm going to come back in a day and a half, and please tell me your reactions to this proposal. And a day and a half later, Mr. Hauff was told that the unanimous consensus of the economists at the meeting was that this was a misguided policy, that the Germans should be promoting science, technology, and innovation in their greatest area of strength, their Mittelstand, their relatively small enterprises, that even today are the secret of the German economic miracle, instead of pumping R&D dollars into giant enterprises. But Hauff went along with this program, and only about 20 years later did Germany realize it had chosen a misguided policy. Well, I had some other things I wanted to say, but I'll just say them very, very briefly rather than providing evidence. There's another part of theory of economic development in 1912 that was emphasized by Germany. By Schumpeter. He said, yes, innovation is provided in those days by small newcomer companies that then become initially monopolies in their field of technology. But then they are imitated by other companies, and there is a swarm. Sooner or later, there is a swarm of imitators, and it was this competitive swarm from imitators that drives prices down, extends the boundaries of the technology, and eventually creates great blessings for all the citizens in an economy. And indeed, this was a very valid insight. I'll provide you just one chart with limited time. Here's a chart from the pioneering study of imitation, or the diffusion of a very important innovation, hybrid corn, done by Harvard's V. Grillicus, although he was at the University of Chicago at the time. And what you see is, in Iowa, from the inception of that innovation until 7 years later, 90% of the farms in Iowa had adopted hybrid corn.